All right, here we go. Welcome to another episode of the Non-Victim Nation podcast. Today I am joined by Drew Walker of what is the actual name of the company?
Walker Defense Research.
Research.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have to admit that I don't know as much as I would love to about that, but I've seen like some of the products that you've put out and things like that, and they seem really interesting. Um,
Yeah.
but before we get into that, I was kind of curious. Can you go over just like at least a little bit of your background and like how you kind of got started and where you are now?
Absolutely. And I'll preface it by saying I wish it was a little more interesting. I'll say I don't actually have an explicit, former law enforcement and military background,
Hmm.
but I'll even, start with even the prequel to that story. It goes way back to when my great uncle actually took me shooting when I was 7. I've been hooked ever since.
Okay.
So over time, you kind of eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff, and it was something that just immediately hooked me. But as you go through high school, college, et cetera, there's no one giving out flyers of how to get into the gun industry,
Right.
how to be part of this.
Hmm.
And so you end up having to break your way into it if you don't find an obvious entry point.
Right.
And I've always had ideas for products. And, I kind of think of Walker Defense Research as an innovation company that just happens to be solely focused on all things firearms industry. So I just took the plunge,
Okay.
and through sheer just force of wanting to be part of it, and the passion behind uh, innovation and all things firearms, it ultimately is where my mind ends up anyway.
Hmm.
So when you teach yourself not just, well, how do you start a company? How do you file a patent? How do patents work?
Right.
How does fluid dynamics work for muzzle brakes? So on and so forth. I want to do this, and I'm very self-taught and very persistent as far as not being the smartest person in the room. So whether it's the practical side of things, people who've been there, done that, seen it all with law enforcement,
Hmm.
and then I'm pretty close to Boeing, so there's a lot of people that I just pick their brains left and right for how things work,
I gotcha.
and you kind of mesh those two over time, and the ideas just flow.
Hmm.
So it was one of those things where I have a whole black binder of things I want to do,
Hmm.
and I've only just kind of scratched the surface. But it was the biggest thing was teaching yourself how do you go from the proverbial idea on a napkin to something real and something useful.
Right.
And what's great is not having the constraints of here's how everything is right now and here's how it has to work.
Hmm.
I've been big on getting off the beaten path, really being open to new exotic materials. I'm really big with additive manufacturing, uh, but it's really uh, I would say really focused on let's think about the outcome first.
Hmm.
As impossible as it may be, what do we want to happen, and kind of work backwards from that success. And so it's really just surrounding yourself with the right people. And as far as breaking into this industry and getting started, it was just starting from the sheer passion of this is what I want to do.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, you go to any sort of career services place, even, college, et cetera, and obviously, with academia, they're not exactly lined up to help further, aerospace defense and especially the firearms world.
Right.
So if you want it bad enough, you got to find a way, and that's pretty much where I started. It's just I've always wanted to,
Hmm.
and I looked for my first opportunity. I had just this burning desire to like let's just go for it.
Right.
Let's make a prototype. Let's stumble, let's fall, let's learn, let's get back up. And with enough help, with enough insight from other people, showing you how to do certain things, whether that's SolidWorks, whether that's materials engineering, whatever,
Hmm.
um, where there's a will, there's a way.
I
And I
gotcha.
think that's, coupled with just surrounding yourself with people who know way more about certain things, whether that's gunfighting. As a gear designer, I will say I have such an emphasis on training,
Right.
and um, kind of case studies of outcomes of here's how this gunfight ended up and here's why,
Hmm.
and you just have to be that sponge. And so I've always liked that phrase of forever a student, sometimes a teacher, because you can just get so much out of that.
Right. So you grew up here in Arizona?
Yes, Tucson,
Okay.
actually.
The reason why I asked that is because I grew up in Washington.
Oh yeah.
And obviously, there's a lot of difference between here and there.
Oh yeah.
And so since you got into kind of the gun culture at such a young age, do you have you seen? I mean, this seems like an obvious question, but like, have you seen a really dramatic change of how things were like when you were younger to kind of the way they are now? I guess
Um,
how would you describe that?
in terms of politically or for
Yeah, that's a lot of it. I mean, because there was a time when even where I grew up, people. had like racks like in their trucks and things like that
Mm.
where they would have rifles and things like that, and that was just a normal thing, right? And now if you do that, you're literally going to get arrested,
I think so. I think
in
there's
and
an unfortunate jumpiness to things that shouldn't be,
hmm
and I think a perfect example is that is just open carry,
hmm
where you got the right, it's codified in the law of you can do it, but you
hmm
have some grandma from Connecticut at the wrong place at the wrong time, in a Home Depot and suddenly freaking out seeing a civilian, with a handgun on their hip.
right.
And so it doesn't know how to handle that
Yeah.
based on where they're from. And that's unfortunate because I feel like uh, I think anyone who's carrying in the open has to keep that in mind of you are the ambassador to the Second Amendment in that moment of the people around you, of how
Right.
you compose yourself, how you carry yourself.
hmm
And it's unfortunate that there's a certain jumpiness and judginess to people where I mean it's obvious anytime you hear the people talking about black rifles
yeah.
and assault weapons bans and things like that
hmm
to characterize a gun on the scary aesthetic is rationality has left the building a long time ago. It's
right.
unfortunate.
hmm
um, the good news I think so there's that side of it, and there's one thing I do like and take for example, and I think perfectly it's a perfect example of a good direction we're going in,
hmm
and that is the brace. Think of that as a
okay.
concept where, I mean, imagine carrying how long a barrel is when you
hmm
think about it.
right.
But you had somebody put something out there that really just made the ATF, kind of twitch and just, I see what you did. I don't like it. And I
Right.
see you guys selling it by the millions or whatever.
hmm
But they found a way around things. They found I think a cheeky way past things, and it's awesome.
hmm
And we didn't just let it lie when they wanted to take them all away and say you had to register them and so on and so forth.
hmm
And so I think there's an appetite, even though in one end I think things are overly sensitive and people are kind of jumpy about some things towards firearms. At the same time, there's a movement within ourselves to say we're kind of sick of that being around. Why can't we have a AR with 11.5 inch,
right.
barrel. Like who cares?
Yeah.
15.9. What's gonna, the
hmm
children are safe. What are we worried about? So there's that appetite
yeah.
to uh, erode away some of these old laws, which I honestly think I wish we'd play more offense
hmm
as an industry.
right.
Not just the whack-a-mole of California's proposing, insert insane bill, but why can't we erode away the NFA over time?
right.
You know, SBRs are obviously low-hanging fruit.
hmm
Let's just start there and get rid of that,
right.
and take suppressors off, and then just keep at it.
hmm
But unfortunately, I think if we were more united and focused, I think we
hmm
could get there. But that's just my personal gripe. I wish we'd play more offense as an industry.
I agree.
Yeah.
I remember when I moved here originally, which was nearly 10 years ago. One of my first experiences was pulling into a gas station and watching a biker get off his bike, and he had a full-on revolver in a leather holster, like cowboy style,
Yep.
just on his hip. And I thought that was the greatest thing ever. It made me laugh, right? But I could totally understand where somebody from a different area, a different culture would see that and obviously be like scared. It's like,
Yeah.
you know, just because he has that doesn't mean he's going to like start pointing and shooting at people.
And I think I blame Hollywood almost exclusively for stuff like that. These
hmm
perceptions like only the police or bad guys have guns and nothing in between.
Right.
And so I think, like, obviously, I have no problem if somebody has open carry. And culturally, though, I do think, unfortunately, we're not as proactive as to kind of chip away at some of these perceptions. It's hard though too
hmm
because you have a lot of people that it's just deep seated with them that they don't see that every day.
Right.
So it's unfortunate. I think
hmm
probably one of the best things we could do. It's probably one of the simplest things we could do is just somebody who's new to firearms, not super exposed.
hmm
I had the luxury of my great uncle taking me in Pennsylvania, use a 22 for the first time, and hooked ever since. And here I
Right.
am. I have him to blame for, all the patents and a whole company and shot show every year, and just,
Right.
complaining about there's not enough room in my safe. Awesome problem to have.
Yeah. Exactly.
Um, so yeah, it's but one of the easiest things I think we can do is just take that buddy who's curious about guns, you know, get him caught up to speed,
hmm
have him try stuff out, have him learn, and I think as soon as you have that familiarity with guns, so much fear from somebody who goes from seeing somebody with open carry,
Hmm.
losing their minds and getting scared over something like that, which you shouldn't, to, yeah, I went shooting the other day and I was surprisingly good at it. And now I'm
Right.
gonna get my first gun. And then
Yeah.
you get kind of pulled into the tribe, so to speak.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, I think the whole thing with Hollywood in particular, there's like this love-hate relationship that it has even with itself, because it will market movies where there's lots of like people with firearms and doing all kinds of things, right? And at the same time, all of the people behind Hollywood, all of like the executives and everybody are so anti-gun. It's like,
yeah.
well, if you're so anti-gun, then why are you don't going so far out of your way to promote the use of these things? You know, you're showing it on both the good and the bad guys, you know, of all these different things. It's like, how can you say you hate it so much that you want it to disappear and that nobody should have a gun, and yet every third movie that you put out is about people using guns?
And usually horribly irresponsibly,
Yeah,
and then none of that's how physics works. And I feel
right,
like that gave a third of MythBusters back when that show was on the material of
right,
like just myths that like that's
yeah,
not how guns work.
yeah.
No, hands down.
One of the best examples I ever saw of that, I can't remember the name of the show. It was on, I want to say it was on Amazon or Netflix. I can't remember exactly. But it was like, it was set in the Old West, so the 1800s, right?
Mhm.
And they show these guys that are using revolvers, right? Single action revolvers, and they're shooting, and you see like brass raining down. It's like, it's absolutely impossible. It doesn't work like that. But for people who don't understand that, that's just kind of the mentality. That's what they understand, you know? And I think that's true of a lot of things. They get so caught up in the things that they see, and they just assume, kind of like suppressors. They've got this belief that a suppressor really silences the gun, that it makes no sound, and that's how people get assassinated. That isn't at all the case.
My favorite part of any time I go shooting with somebody and they use a suppressor for the first time
Hmm.
is when they say, "Well, it doesn't make that like James Bond chirp that I've never heard any suppressor make
Right.
ever." That stereotypical, like I forget which movie I'm trying to reference specifically, but
Uh-huh.
you've heard like the old Hollywood
Right.
kind of chirp of a suppressor, and they're expecting that hands down.
Hmm.
Just and they're like, "Well, did I get a dud or something? What's going on here?" Or the fact that sometimes you actually should still have your pro on. You know, it's not
Right.
silent.
Yeah.
I think the original patent for suppressor was labeled a silencer, but I think the term is really appropriate, an important distinction,
Hmm.
because you know even when I'm going to CanCon here soon, and what's great about that event coming up, it's local in Phoenix, is you have all these suppressors, all these different calibers side by side, and you can
Hmm.
see the range of utility for what they do, what you can expect out of each one of them, what they're kind
Hmm.
of built for. Some
Hmm.
focus on back pressure reduction. Some are just really trying to knock down that concussion if you have like a CQB length can.
Hmm.
Um, and it's really a treat to use those all side by side. So someone like me can nerd out. But what's really crazy about that is, you know, when you're shooting a 5.56 suppressor and, how many times have I heard it where somebody gets their first 5.56 can and they're like, "Oh, it's a lot louder than I thought."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Well, yeah, I'm
Right.
using subsonic amp." No.
No.
But it was shocking to them because in their mind they just assumed it worked a certain
Right.
way.
And so this is where a lot of the misinformation comes in, because you've got like, I've watched videos of like people that are in the ATF and other organizations, right, demonstrating like different things with firearms you would never ever do. I remember during the Rittenhouse trial, you know, the lawyer was like just willy nilly, like, flagging everybody with that firearm. It's like you would never do that. You have no concept of what or how to treat that firearm, let alone the actual rules that you should be following. And you're going to tell us that you're the expert on what we should or shouldn't be doing. Yeah. And that is a term that has like become so overused that like nobody can believe it anymore.
Well, that, and as you know, with people in this industry, there's a ton of knowledge. And
Hmm.
so when you see something like that and you look around to all of your friends and you're like, who on earth among us would ever do something so stupid like this?
Hmm.
And this is who they call in.
Right.
And it makes you really think, like, was it to really find an expert or the person who would help corroborate the narrative we're trying to weave?
Hmm.
Because with suppressors, again, there's a undeniable utility and practicality to having them, But I think, I blame 1930s gangster movies for thinking that these are like assassination tools and could be nothing else,
Right.
which, so what, first of all. But second of all, just the sheer practicality of not having to have ear pro all the time,
Mhm.
or just the sheer comfort and joy of shooting with them on.
Mhm.
Then you go to a place like, I believe in the UK, where they're ultra strict in some ways with firearm laws, but things like suppressors actually, way more attainable and easier to get than here, ironically.
Yeah.
So no one's really thinking, because it's not this scary item. There's an
Mhm.
aura around it that's completely undue. And if you
Mhm.
spend enough time with one, you're like, why is this so regulated? This is insane.
Right.
Um, but there we go, thinking for ourselves, which
Right.
is, that's our first mistake.
Yeah. And then the whole, thing with like the NFA and the regulating a rifle that is less than 16 inches, as being more lethal or more dangerous or more whatever. It's like that's ridiculous,
I heard a
you know.
story, and I hope I know my history correctly,
Hmm.
but I believe, if I'm correct, um, as they were kind of piecing together the NFA before it became law, that they
Hmm.
actually wanted to have handguns in there as well, along with short rifles.
Right.
The handgun portion didn't make it in, but they kept the short rifles.
Right.
So it's one of those things where, this is what they originally wanted.
Hmm.
And because the barrel was short, they were going to include both of those.
Hmm.
But imagine if they had gotten their way. That
Right.
would, by today's standards, unthinkable to have like a Glock 17, and you've got, got to pay a tax stamp and everything. And,
Right.
um, but to think about, okay, so that's the direction to the level they wanted to take things.
Hmm.
And then what do you know? That didn't make it into the ultimate line. Hopefully, I'm correct in the
Hmm.
history behind this, is from what I've read.
Right.
So I'll preface it with that. But the fact that we haven't chipped away at that
Hmm.
in the years since the NFA has become law is insane. Like, we can't just get the whole silly barreling thing off the books. It's especially when it's, common practice, the M4, 14.5-inch barrel,
Hmm.
that's in common use by the military. So if
Hmm.
you get an old, like, milsurp upper, essentially,
Hmm.
that has to be an SBR. It has to be a special regulated thing, but it's only,
Right.
an inch and a half shorter than is legal. Like, why do we care so much?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's think through this. I think we can do it.
Yeah. So I think that it's become whatever the intention was, and even the intention I think was flawed. But even if you set that aside, since then it's like a lot of other things. It's become a way for the state to make money.
Yeah.
It's like there was a point in time where the people were given traffic citations as a punishment. This is a way to discourage certain points of behavior,
Yeah.
right? It wasn't a money making thing for the county. That's what it's become. It's like now they have quotas. It's like not only do you have to write these, you have to write X number of them because we need this revenue. Like, well, that isn't the reason why these things were put into place. You're supposed to be discouraging a particular type of behavior, right?
Mhm.
You're not supposed to be actively looking for people to punish just because you have extra time
Right.
on your hands,
Oh, absolutely. Or,
So,
or the fact that, like, even silly things with, AOWs and stuff. Just take, for example, let's say you have a G17, easy example.
hmm.
And of course, you hold it at its obvious point for a grip, two hands. But
Right.
if you were to have another vertical grip, only a couple inches beyond, still two hands, you
Right.
got to register that.
Yeah.
Like, what are we worried about? Or whether it's a AR pistol and you've got a angled foregrip
Hmm.
and versus a vertical one, and the angled's fine, vertical, no. Do we really care about the angle of grip? What do we?
Yeah.
We've gotten to such absurdity,
Hmm.
but I honestly feel like gun laws have only gone as far as they have because there's not been adequate resistance.
Hmm.
And
So,
imagine if we did mount that level of like kind of counter assault, so to speak, to take back lost ground.
right.
Um, all it takes is the will, and
Mhm.
that's one of those things that's just it's sad to see. Little encroachments over time, and little big in their own right. Take for example in the '80s, the whole it's semi-auto but it's open bolt. And they're like, oh yeah, well it's too easy to convert, and I'm like, yeah, but if you do convert it, that's its own situation,
Hmm.
but you didn't.
Hmm.
So can't we just leave it be? It's semi-auto,
Right.
And it's like nobody asked for this one little change,
Mhm.
So it's just all sorts of stupid little things that over time add up
Mhm.
that what are we doing where we're not peeling it back?
Mhm.
I feel like we got to go way beyond just being friction for whatever, cockamamie bullshit that the left comes up with
Right.
for gun laws, and not just be friction and play whack-a-mole with that. But again,
Mhm.
not to lament the point, but in
Mhm.
fact, retake lost ground entirely and make your presence known, not just, you know,
Mhm.
slow them down.
Right.
You gotta take it to the next level.
So the whole way that anti-gun organizations, just the way that they operate is always kind of baffling to me. It's like I heard recently that there's an adapter that you can put onto a Glock that makes it a fully automatic firearm, right?
Mhm.
And so this adapter is already illegal. You're not supposed to have it in the first place, right? But instead of saying, well, if you get caught with this thing, you're in trouble, they're saying that anybody who has a Glock that's capable of accepting this is in trouble. It's like,
Mhm.
that doesn't make any sense. You know, my car is capable of doing well over 100 miles an hour. That doesn't mean I drive it that way, and you can't punish me for having something that's capable of doing something just on the off chance that I might decide that I want to.
Mhm.
That's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous way of thinking of things,
Well, there we
you
go,
know.
using logic. It's kind of funny. I forget which TED Talk it is, but there was it was one about the part of the brain that makes decisions
Hmm.
is not the one that let's use for, facts and figures and rational thought. It deals with emotions.
Right.
So unfortunately, the left often appeals to that
Hmm.
part of the brain where it moves the emotions and gets people whipped up over things that are absolutely wrong and illogical. It can be defeated in any real argument of facts and logic,
Right.
which imagine that being the most important thing. And instead, you have all sorts of people just reacting to that feeling that you whipped up within them that comes from just it's deceptive.
Hmm.
And so they're using that emotion effectively, unfortunately, to get people not to think, not to question, not to actually say, like, this doesn't actually make any sense,
Hmm.
but instead just react based on how they felt.
Right.
And it's incredibly powerful. And I wish we take that into consideration much more as we construct kind of how we go about things.
Right.
But it's crazy because like the logic does not work for them.
Hmm.
That's completely on our side.
Right.
Just right up there with personal responsibility. And, God forbid, that's
Yeah. Without getting too far off topic, there's the whole thing here in Arizona lately. They they didn't strike down an old Civil War era law for abortion,
mhm,
right? So this is the big thing everybody's getting wrapped around the axle with lately. Okay. Um, and they talk about this. The hyperbole that goes with this is that because they're not allowing women to have abortions just whenever they want to, or without any reasons, without any limitations, rather, that women are going to die, that their lives are in danger. It's like, how about the other side of that, where you say, what is your personal responsibility? It's like, if you don't want to have children, don't have
mhm.
sex. If that's
That's how
not an
that
option,
happens. Yeah.
yeah, then use contraceptives, use whatever it is that you need to do to prevent that from happening. And that's not 100% guarantee, but at least it's an option. It's a way for you to prevent that in the first place.
As soon as I heard that news, and I mean, the obvious conclusion is the people who are against it are going to just have their glorious hissy fit
Hmm.
and just have their complete come apart and meltdown. And it's just going to be like throwing a cat in a bathtub. Just absolute, just sparks, a lot of profanity, stuff like that, a lot of
Right.
incoherent, unga bunga sounds, and
Uh,
trying to make an argument. And the people for it are for it and completely
mhm.
happy with it. But at the end of the day, I've always rejected this idea that there's just no personal responsibility.
Right.
And, yeah, you use sex as a handshake, probably gonna get pregnant. It's probably gonna happen. And, let's think backwards on choices here.
Hmm.
And like we were saying before we started, I love the movie Idiocracy,
Hmm.
but the older I've gotten, which is not meant to be like a back in my day, so
Yeah.
I was not prepared to be like, wow, this movie is essentially a tongue-in-cheek documentary.
Hmm.
And there's just like we have this tendency in society to make stupid people famous, but we don't condemn people over just raw, like, you screwed up.
Yeah.
You did wrong. You chose wrong. You made a choice.
Yes.
There are consequences to that
Hmm.
choice. Um, and that seems to be out the window for a lot of people, unfortunately.
Hmm. Yeah, it's the same thing with like, gun rights and those sorts of things. It's like it's personal responsibility. It has nothing to do with the firearm itself.
Yeah.
The firearms didn't just come into existence in the last 50 years, let alone the last 20, 30 years when all the school shootings and things really started to happen, escalate, right? It's like it's not like they didn't exist prior to that. There was a reason why they didn't have the same issues then, is because our society was significantly different then. The things that have very clearly fallen apart: the nuclear family, our education system, our movement away from religion and personal responsibility,
Yeah.
plus all of the other extreme leftist like ideologies that promote the the absolute decline of logic and reason and reality. You know, of course, none of that can be responsible for anything that's
Mhm.
happening. It all has to be because of the firearms themselves. That's a ridiculous way to think of it.
It is, and you can tell where they're trying to go with things because and this is unfortunate, but you see the tactic time and time again. They wait for some unspeakable tragedy.
Hmm.
And I will say, as somebody who designs gear and very proud of what I put out there and what I do,
Hmm.
um, I would never want to see my stuff on the weapon of a shooter. No one in this industry does.
Right.
Hands down, we don't want to see anything happen like that. Uh, at the same time, when it comes to whatever they used,
Hmm.
they wait where the emotions run high and they capitalize on it and strike where the iron's hot, and they try to get legislation passed in the heat of the moment while
Hmm.
people are grieving, while people are absolutely mentally and emotionally torn apart
Hmm.
and severely compromised with any sort of rational thinking. And then you look back and there's always telltale signs that this person's got a screw loose.
Hmm.
There were warning signs. We didn't pay attention. We didn't, there were all these times to prevent things from getting worse.
Hmm.
And but the easy, let's not think too hard about anything. Critical thinking is not our friend. Solutions, let's just go blame the gun
Hmm.
because that's marketable in the moment. And
Right.
so they push that ultra hard, but they're using uh, the deaths of children to push their agenda, which how sick can you get?
Hmm.
But that's when they do it.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, they're using that emotion because they can't use logic.
Right.
Logic says murder's always been illegal.
Hmm.
Logic says that this person has had a whole litany of issues in the past. There have been warning signs. People ignored them.
Hmm.
And the responsibility ultimately falls on somebody committing some sort of unspeakable act because these guns have been around forever.
Hmm.
And imagine somebody having personal responsibility for doing something unspeakable. Uh, and think of it just sheer numbers for sake of argument with the amount of guns out there in civilian hands. Those are rookie numbers. We got to get those up.
Yep.
Uh, when you think about that, were you to ban them somehow and somehow be successful,
Hmm.
somehow, which they never will be, you're not going to put a dent in things to say that someone, if they want to bad enough, if they're motivated badly enough,
Hmm.
could do something horrendous.
Right.
And it doesn't have to involve a gun, but
Hmm.
a sick mind and somebody who chooses a commitment to evil, an unspeakable evil, will find a way unless somebody who's on the side of good and capable
Hmm.
steps into the arena, cracks their knuckles, stares through them, and takes them down. It
Right.
takes a good guy able to counter the bad guy who's committed to doing what they're doing.
Right.
And the gun is just this, let's not think too hard about this solution from people who want to get their way
Hmm.
and they wait for that opportune moment. And it's sick.
Hmm.
Um, but again, it comes back to using that emotion and the part of the brain that makes decisions to sway them in that moment. Because when things like that aren't happening, no one cares what they have to say.
Right.
And it's the Bill of Rights, not the Bill of Needs. So it's such a dangerous moment anytime you have one of those unfortunate tragedies.
Right.
Is let's go after something that you have a constitutional right to,
Hmm.
and it plays on emotion and the sheer ignorance of people out there who don't know better,
Right.
unfortunately.
So there was just recently a shooting that happened, and I don't remember exactly where. Um, but there was a man that was pulled over. Police were trying to get him to comply with, the man's roll down your window when you talk to you. He was refusing to everything that he had, and he was apparently there was a reason why they were like pulling him over. I don't know all of the details. I just heard about this, right? But what I do know is that at some point he drew a firearm. He fired and shot one of the officers and fired um, back at them, and they opened fire on him. Okay, they fired a total of 96 rounds and ended up killing this individual. Okay, so if you listen to that scenario, you understand that there was a reason why they shot
Hmm.
and why they shot to eliminate a threat.
Hmm.
Okay, that makes perfect sense, right? But when mainstream media gets a hold of it, the way that they portray it is black man was shot by officers 96 times.
Yeah.
That's a completely different story than the one I just told you. Okay. And yet almost every major news organization presented it in almost that exact same context that a black man was shot by police and his total shots of 96 times were used to kill him, leaving out the fact that he fired first.
Yeah.
Okay. He opened up, he fired 11 shots of his own, and he did actually hit another officer who also was black.
Yeah.
None of that is in the story. None of that is in the headline that they're giving to you, right? But that's the way that they're presenting things because they want to spin things in a very particular light to make it seem like the police are evil, that this guy was completely innocent and they were unjustified in doing what they did.
Well, their approach completely reveals their intentions
Hmm.
because I'm way past this idea that there's a subtle bias in certain media. And instead, what we're seeing here is the beauty of investigative journalism, word to be in its unadulterated true form,
Hmm.
should be I'm digging up the facts, I'm presenting them to the public,
Hmm.
and you do with it what you like, but here are the facts and here's the story.
Right.
Versus, and I use the word story very deliberately, versus here's what I want you to think.
Hmm.
Here's my story for you.
Right.
They cherry pick, I think, very deliberately. I've thrown this idea out the window that like it's just unintentional and people are putting their cognitive biases within things and they dig into what they want to tell people and present what they want you to think.
Right.
And so it's social engineering. It's 100% not an accident.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, there's a big commitment to it. And you actually have to do quite a bit of digging yourself if you want to uncover what exactly happened,
Hmm.
which unfortunately, and super ugly, there it is, plain as day. It was there in front of you. But they obviously chose to say X, Y, and Z instead so
Hmm.
that they could get you to think a certain way and therefore draw those conclusions. So it's super nefarious. It's just like
Right.
it's a deliberate decision they're making,
Right.
you know.
And the only thing that the conclusion that I come to from that is that they're trying to inspire another George Floyd type scenario that incites riots and all these other things, because on some level that's going to help the current administration,
Hmm.
get reelected because they don't have anything else.
Yeah,
So they're trying to manipulate the situation. They go even further than that. The situation like itself was pretty horrific, right? But the image that they chose to show of this individual was his picture from high school when he was 18. Nice clean boy.
I know exactly what they're
Right?
doing. Yeah,
Yeah, rather than the mugshot of him 5 months prior, committing a different crime. It's like you're obviously trying to manipulate things to suit your outcome, right?
absolutely.
And the best thing that I can take away from this is the American people have finally at least started to catch on to the idea. It's like maybe we shouldn't just jump to conclusions. Maybe we shouldn't just accept everything that they say at face value. Let's step back and think about this, or at least for a minute before we react.
100%.
You
I
know?
think over time, I'd say especially over the last 20, 30 years,
Hmm.
there's been, I think, a change and this has affected gun culture as well and how it's perceived, et cetera. But there used to be that grumbling, that buzzword of liberal media bias, as if it was just some kind of bit of a twist at the end. Wasn't super conspicuous, but one could argue that that was a little bit slanted. Versus now, it's a complete propaganda machine,
Hmm.
and with a deliberate outcome. And there's even been leaks of journalists and agencies and so on and so forth collaborating with certain media to suppress certain stories on certain platforms. And when that comes out, you see there's a whole machine under the hood of these inner workings, which we've all suspected, and
Hmm.
it's active coordination, and it's trying to take control of the public narrative because that's how propaganda works.
Hmm.
And so when you realize that they're working along the lines of how propaganda works as opposed to true, honest, unbiased journalism,
Right.
we got to throw this idea out the window that there's an attempt to be unbiased, and this is just how the chips fall where they may.
Right.
But as soon as you see something like that, I think over time there's been certain bellwether moments where, oh, hands down, like it's becoming more obvious that this is not just a bias.
Hmm.
There's collusion. There's here's what we want people to think. So this is what we're going to report, and this is what we're not going to report.
Right.
Because, like you said, the picture that they chose, the things they chose to omit, the details of the shooting that would really uh, not inflame certain emotions among the public. It's all surgically chosen.
Hmm.
It couldn't be more carefully done. Of oh yeah, it's because it's on purpose.
Right.
Imagine. So
Yeah. It's literally a curated story
absolutely is.
for their agenda, and to kind of go back to something you said earlier, somebody who was determined to be evil and commit acts of atrocity, things like that. Just this morning in Australia, well, morning for us, daytime for them, there was a man that walked around inside of a mall and stabbing individuals with a knife. And I don't remember exactly the total number of people that he injured or killed, but I know that at least one of those was an infant that he stabbed with a knife. Okay. There's something obviously wrong with this individual, but the absolute one thing that nobody can disparage or disagree with is it wasn't the knife's fault. That individual had intention and
Mhm.
desire to cause harm to other people, and he did it with whatever implement it was available to him.
Yeah,
Okay. Had it been a gun, it would have been a whole other story, right? But the fact that it was a knife doesn't change the fact that he did something that was horrific,
absolutely.
right? So you can take away from that what you want, but if even like you said, even if they were able somehow to magically say, okay, there's no more guns in America, that doesn't mean that the evil and harm is going to stop. People who want to do those things will find a way to do it.
Yeah,
And what terrifies me is that people will do it in a way that is more catastrophic than what they have available now. A person walking into any location with a gun and opening fire is one thing. A person walking in with a bomb, suicide bombers, people like that,
yeah,
that walk in, that level of destruction and damage and loss to life is remarkably,
catastrophic. Yeah,
yeah,
I don't think there was a round fired in Oklahoma City.
you know,
When that incident occurred, I mean, you look back on the trial and the things that led to that bombing,
mhm,
and something unspeakable happened, and there you go. Um, but it's interesting that when there is a shooting and there happens to be a committed leftist, behind that,
mhm,
behind the barrel, suddenly that story just kind of whimpers into nothing. It
right,
doesn't fit a narrative.
mhm,
And instead, we don't just call evil for what it is
mhm,
and place that at the shooter's feet or the murderer's feet, essentially, not to take it all about the weapon used.
mhm,
Uh, it all comes back to personal responsibility because you're right. I remember stories about like high school kids having gun racks in their pickup truck, and that was relatively normal in terms of
mhm,
society. Imagine if we had that today.
right,
People, like you said early on when we started, just that's unfathomable to people today.
mhm,
But nothing happened back then. That was considered so culturally normal that life went on. What do you know?
right. Well, even on that note, there are like I've heard the story more than once where like children who are in school that have like t-shirts or hats that display anything that's related to like the Second Amendment, don't tread on me. They're being asked to like take these things off because it's offensive and it causes harm and all these other things. It's like it's a shirt or
Yeah.
it's a hat. It's like
My favorite's the story about some little kid who nibbled a Pop Tart in the shape of a gun, got sent home from school. And I'm like, if we're going to call that a weapon,
right.
we've lost our mind. But the problem is you have the wrong people in charge. You have
Yes.
the wrong people not using any critical thinking. And what they do is similar to gun laws is they're meant to be a nuisance. They're meant to stick it to you to an industry that they don't like,
Right.
to just make things difficult.
Hmm.
And so, what do you know? It's not actually to stop, it's not to make anyone safer. It's not to prevent any crime. It's just to be a pain in the ass,
Right.
is what it is.
Yeah.
And so, stuff like worrying about, you know, little kid nibbling a Pop Tart in the shape of a handgun. Um, let's pick our battles here,
Right.
but it's obviously not about that. It's about they don't like firearms. They're obviously on the wrong side of things politically.
Mhm.
And as we've seen in recent years, they want to indoctrinate kids. They want
Yes.
to infuse their politics and influence wherever they can, unfortunately. And if you're not careful, they will.
Right. So I've been talking about this a little bit on the podcast, but a lot to among people that I know about how bad our education system has become and about how it literally has become an indoctrination of children from the earliest age possible. Things that 10, 20, 30, especially like when I was a kid, would never have been acceptable, right?
Yeah,
Showing children in grade school pornographic material and saying that this is for their education.
yeah,
That's absolutely
and they
ridiculous.
can barely read.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's like you're trying to hypersexualize people who aren't even capable of having sex yet.
yeah.
You know, why is that? What's the end goal there? Then they've got the other group of people that want to normalize things like pedophilia. It's like, how is that okay? Again, 10, 20, 30 years ago, that would have never been acceptable, but somehow,
Unthinkable.
it is now.
I
They're,
think the biggest, sorry, not to
no,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
The biggest telltale sign is when there's a school district where a parent stands up, and I can't emphasize, as a parent myself, get involved with what your kids are watching, who their teachers are, what they're being taught. But when there's a demand for, I want to see what's being taught to my kids, and they're like, we don't have to disclose that.
Hmm.
Where there's smoke, there's fire. Like there's already something very wrong if like I don't want to tell you what I'm teaching,
Right.
or there was this is one of the few times where I'll say, thank God this kid had a cell phone. One of the
Right.
few times I'll ever say that, but it was some gender bullshit in the middle of a math class at a
Hmm.
public school, and I'm like, what part of calculus is this or algebra?
Hmm.
No,
Right.
but there's no way that could be somehow even tangentially related
Yeah.
to anything that they would normally be taught in that subject.
Right.
And you just got to be hyper vigilant because what was unthinkable not that many years ago,
Hmm.
it's popping up left and right is like, yeah, that was Tuesday. That just happened.
Right.
So, I mean, that's what kind of keeps me up at night is, um, some asshole trying to influence your kids,
Hmm.
especially on the down low, and they know what they're doing.
Hmm.
And you just have to have that relationship that listen to them, spend time, let them talk.
Hmm.
And it's scary times because they don't hide it very well,
Right.
and they're not ashamed of themselves. They know exactly what they're doing.
Hmm. So being in you're part of the gun industry, we'll call it that, and the products that you produce and things like that. So how much of that do you share with your children and like kind of contribute to their education or their understanding of those things?
So it comes down to a healthy respect,
Hmm.
and you get to them early on, and we do talk about history. We do talk about the Constitution, American Revolution, the why behind the Second Amendment, and they know what I do,
Hmm.
and they know we have guns, and a lot of them.
Right.
High five. Um, and there's no shame in that. That's not a bad thing.
Right.
At the same time, I have to tell them we don't talk about this at your school. We don't talk about this. It's pretty much you have to be careful what you say to certain people because they could make it a thing. They
Hmm.
could make it in something that they shouldn't. And so there's a certain education that you have to give them when it comes to now there's obviously personal habits on my end where um, you don't leave things laying around, obviously.
Right.
Safety is non-negotiable. But even something as uh, my son, for example, has I don't know if you've heard of them. They're kind of like airsoft gel blasters.
Okay.
They're like essentially 7, 8 millimeter water beads that you fill up with, put them in a bucket of water, especially warm water, makes it go faster. A few hours
Hmm.
later, they go from like a grain of sand and they swell up.
Okay.
Well, of course, the one I got him is works exactly like an HKG G36, a gun I hope to have someday. I also got one that's just
Right.
like just a classic M4,
Hmm.
with a front sight post, carry handle, etc. The safety and the magazine release, all of it works the same way as a
Hmm.
real one. So there's an opportunity there, and that's they, my son and my daughter, both very young, but they know about flagging. They know about how things work from
Hmm.
the toy essentially, but we're very big on safety. We're
Right.
very big on good habits and knowing what's real, and we don't touch it. Um, and but never to demonize it.
Hmm.
These are tools like anything else, but they have to have a respect. I also don't put things, within their reach or any sort of possibility of access because,
Right.
I'm not an idiot. But at the same time, when it comes down to Like even when my son first got Nerf guns,
Mhm.
there were certain things about just not keeping your finger on the trigger. And you'd start early with good habits and good
Right.
awareness because it's not what we do the one time, it's what we do every time. And it's that habit you build.
Right.
So, he's not at the age to take him to 22 quite yet,
Mhm.
but there's little things that I need him to know. Yes, this is what daddy does.
Mhm.
Yes, it's a good thing.
Mhm.
Um, but it's not for you yet. But we're going to work on little things.
Right.
Certain things like safety, muzzle awareness, a lot of really good habits that you can build and talk about the why behind.
Mhm.
But it's actually just like recently, actually, built my own office, and he was using a lot of power tools with me. I got the opportunity to teach him,
Right.
and it was cool to share that with him. But it was learning that care and respect
Mhm.
of course, a simulated way at first.
Mhm.
But there was that opportunity.
Right.
Um, but you have to. One of the big things is getting to him first. Of I don't make it a secret what I do. At the
Mhm.
same time, I will never let anyone like demonize like, oh, it's a hush hush, it's a bad thing that I do.
Right.
But they also know, certain things like school. We don't talk about that.
Mhm.
Um, there's a certain sensitivity that I want them to realize that not everyone thinks the way we do.
Mhm.
And that's been a hard thing to kind of articulate because
Right.
they know me, they know their mom, and
Yeah.
it's all safe.
Mhm.
But not everyone has the same values outside of her family.
Mhm.
And so for a little kid, that's hard. So there's a lot of education. There's a lot of just father son moments and father daughter moments of just learning.
Right.
But it is actually pretty cool to they know the basics. They've not shot a real gun yet, and they will eventually.
Right.
But muzzle awareness, flagging, breaking that 180 plane.
Mhm.
I mean, these are gel blasters or Nerf guns, but always got eye protection on. Like little habits you can build
Right.
early
Mhm.
and kind of build up to something bigger later.
Yeah. So kind of on that, I was just thinking about this, that
Yeah.
like the idea that you have things that simulate firearms, right? But in your house, I'm sure that you have things that are like actual
Mhm.
tools. You have hammers, you have drills, you have saws, you have steak knives, you have any number of things that could be implemented as weapons or
Mhm.
that could actually cause harm, whether they're intentional or not, right? And nobody thinks twice about any of those things, right? Granted, you don't just leave a power drill laying in the middle of the room where a kid can get hold of
Mhm.
it, right? But the idea that they have at least some access to those things is never put on the same level as a
Of
firearm
course.
when realistically one is just as deadly as the other, you know? And the simplest thing, which is something that I can always go back to, it's like more children die in swimming pools by
Yes.
far, like just an overwhelming number. It's a
Especially in this
staggering
city in the
number.
summer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
versus firearms or any other thing that they could, fall prey to, and nobody thinks twice about that. It's like,
Yeah.
that's far more, that's a much bigger hazard and a much bigger danger to your children. And yet everybody thinks, well, it's a swimming pool.
Well, there's what I can do as a father, and then there's, let's say, if they're at somebody's house
Hmm.
who's negligent.
Hmm.
I can control what I can control.
Right.
But if I imbue in them a sense of responsibility and awareness,
Hmm.
and to know that even if they know what that is,
Right.
don't touch it, don't pick it up,
Hmm.
go tell an adult. There's a certain level of they know what to do,
Right.
and there's that wisdom that falls with them, even if you're not present. Which they're sponges. They everything that you do, they want to
Hmm.
do too.
Right.
And so, can't emphasize enough. Like teach what you can, and give them that wisdom, and give them that healthy perspective of things.
Right.
At the same time, yeah, like I said, I don't hide what I do, and
Hmm.
they're interested. For example, we made make bolt carrier groups,
Nice.
and one of the things that I'm really big on that I think not every company does is I'm really big on stripping down each BCG and making sure that we've got no tolerance stacking. It's ready to run hard. The bolt cams back and forth like butter for each
Hmm.
one of them. There's nothing that's like this one's a little bit tight. And so there's a level of kind of hand precision to making sure that each one is good to go.
Hmm.
And we're really big on QC. And so things like that, my son's very mechanically inclined. So yeah, he knows how to put together a BCG. You'd see me do it a million times. And so it's one of those things where it's like there's no harm there.
Right.
Obviously, wash your hands when you're done.
Hmm.
Um, but learning the ins and outs and how things work, it's kind of cool to share as well.
Right. So you just touched on one of the major points there, though, that's personal responsibility.
Yes,
It's like you're teaching them that responsibility at a very early age, not just for the actual end use of the firearm, but all of the parts that kind of come before it, and like what's okay and what's not okay. And granted, you can't always be around, but if you've instilled those things in them at a relatively early age, then they have that cognitive ability to say, this is these things are okay and these things are not,
for sure.
and that falls back on you as a parent, and it falls back on making sure that they understand, not that you just tell them, but that they understand what you've explained.
Absolutely. It's one thing, it's a company value, but it's also something that I'm really proud that I really kind of drilled in really well to both my kids. But my son, as I'm teaching him how to, use certain tools and things like that, um, I'm really big on do it right the first time
Hmm.
and don't half-ass it, don't do it quick and cheap.
Right.
And here's why. And he's really big on let's do it right,
Hmm.
which I love that. So it's not just what you do, but how you do it.
Right.
And I just think that you know, that carries forward into years to come,
Hmm.
for sure.
So I think it's a funny thing that people, a lot of times parents, maybe not so much anymore, but it used to be like when I was a kid, there's a lot of like, A, children are supposed to be seen and not heard,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
B, do as I say, not as I do. Those two things are absolute bullshit.
Yep.
Okay. They
And
really
they
are.
see everything.
Okay. Yeah, everything that you do, they observe and they learn from it, right? They're never ever going to do what you say. They're mostly going to do what they see you doing, right? If you are a respectable, responsible human being with, and you have a good work ethic and those sorts of things, that's what they're going to model,
Oh yeah.
right? If you're a piece of shit who treats other people like shit, again, that's what they're going to model.
I've heard the phrase, which I could attribute it to something, but whatever. But we are who we are when no one's looking.
Right.
Thing is they're always looking.
Right.
You'd be surprised what they pick up,
Mhm.
especially when you're driving.
Right. Yeah. Um, so, like I said, children observe and they understand and they learn far more than we give them credit for.
Hmm.
Even at a very early age, they're always learning from what they see and what they understand.
Absolutely.
And granted, they may not understand the reasons why we do what we do, but that doesn't change the fact that that's what they see. And so in their minds, that's how things should be.
For sure.
you know and that model comes from people who are in relationships and then get a divorce, right?
Yeah.
um because the parents treat each other badly, or they don't know how to communicate, or they don't get along, right? And so they're setting that example for the children. It's like, this is what's supposed to happen. I've heard other things where, like, the parents, like, they're obviously not getting along, they're not capable of getting along, but they stay together, quote unquote, for the sake of the children. But all that's teaching the children is to do is repeat that exact same pattern, to go out and find people that they can't get along with and to just promote that same idea. It's like, you're not helping, you're not making that situation better. You know, you need to understand that just because you're not saying it specifically doesn't mean that they're not learning it.
Hmm.
So that's an important thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, with that being said, like, how much of your work ethic and things like that you carry forward into your business, how much do you feel came from your parents and your upbringing?
I'd say quite a bit. And part of it's also necessity of once you start a business as well. I was very much raised with the whole do it right the first time, don't cut corners.
Mhm.
And I've hated this idea, especially growing up. My dad taught me this concept of planned obsolescence and to hate it. And
Okay.
it drives me crazy. It's one of the reasons that, for one of our products, not to have a shameless plug or anything like that, is, a lot of muzzle brakes are made out of steel.
Hmm.
I chose Inconel because it's a super alloy, nickel chromium base made for like jet and rocket engines. It's actually made for high heat and pressure, which is perfect for a suppressor or brake or flash hider, etc. It's just ungodly expensive,
Hmm.
but it's the perfect material for it.
Right.
And it was instilled in me early on of just, you know, it's always or it's always most expensive to buy the cheap piece of crap thing first
Right.
because you have to replace it really fast
Hmm.
versus the thing that you spend a good penny on, it's made to last forever, and it was just done right.
Right.
And that had a huge impact because I hated this idea that something is deliberately engineered to fail at a certain point, just so you have to buy it again.
Hmm.
And to me, that's like any good engineer that I know, it just makes their stomach churn of just like, so I have to basically make something about this crappy so it
Right.
breaks so that we get more money.
Hmm.
But you know, you're doing something crappy. You know,
Hmm.
like every engineer wants to make awesome stuff,
Right.
the good ones anyway. And when you're designing, and there was SolidWorks working with them, and whether it's a product development situation or whatnot, you're always thinking of what's possible, what's cool, and how do we make this awesome and better.
Hmm.
But when you take that in the opposite direction of like, how can we make this fail at a certain point? Like,
Right.
I can't do that. That drives me crazy. Just the mentality of like, we're going to deliberately make it, deliberately engineer an Achilles heel out of sheer greed.
Right.
And so, no, absolutely. I would definitely credit my dad with that. And um, that's made its way into all of our products. I just do not believe in planned obsolescence. It's do it once, be proud of it. Your name's on the side of it,
Hmm.
and stand by it. And anything else is just the short term trying to juice your spreadsheets for that extra buck. But it's just not how
Right.
it's just not how you're supposed to do things.
Right.
Yeah.
So, like, where in the of the things that you've produced, like, what did you start with, and was that the thing that you wanted to start with, or is that just kind of what was the easiest thing to kind of like get going, and then you knew you'd move from there?
It was probably the idea most at the back of my mind. So I came out with an idea. I actually ended up using a Glock 18 at Scottsdale Gun Club.
Hmm.
Uh, Met up with an SOT and started off with 3 5 rounds at a time. Worked my way up to 33. That was a lot of fun. Did I hit the ceiling for the camera's purposes? No. Um, but it's I think what
Right.
a G18's about, if I remember correctly, about 1,200 rounds a minute, and
Okay.
it's a just an impressive bullet hose.
Hmm.
And by the time you're bringing the um, bringing it back down after firing that first shot, it's working on shots 6, 7, 8, 9. It's just climbing.
Hmm.
And so I kept thinking, and I was very familiar with all the breaks and comps and stuff out there. This thing was aggressively compensated. So why can't we make something, man, in the realm of physics, can we make something that would actually just keep it level?
Hmm.
And especially for rapid target acquisition and just control the weapon. I'm not saying that the G18 wasn't reliable,
Hmm.
but what's the point if it just goes from, you know, south and north pretty
Right.
fast, like
Right.
instantly, and it takes so much effort just to control it, and it's compensated. What can we do to make it? What could make it absolutely flat?
Hmm.
So it got my mind turning, and I kind of ended up with a lot of traditional brake designs, and it's just been done to death.
Hmm.
So the first product was the Nero 556, and it stood for Neutralizing Energy Remain in Origin, which is a fun acronym. Who cares? To pretty much say, and we didn't go obviously with the Glock platform.
Right.
Like the bread and butter is going to be your AR-15 half by 28 muzzle device, but on full auto, I want it to just sit there. I want it
Right.
to just be level
Hmm.
and relatively speaking for a break, not have that same concussion where I don't want to shoot this indoors.
Yeah.
And so using fluid dynamics and like computational fluid dynamics, so flow modeling of how the gases go through the break,
Hmm.
we arrived at a very unique shape, which gets a
Hmm.
lot of reaction from people, good and bad, because it doesn't look like other breaks.
Right.
But at the end of the day, you put a Magpul D60 drum fully loaded, put it in your rifle. If it has a happy switch. Uh,
Yeah.
you dump those 60 rounds, and is oddly controllable.
Hmm.
And you can just pretty much just watch it be still.
Right.
And
So, not to
yeah, yeah,
interrupt, but
of course.
like when it comes to breaks and that sort of thing, people that aren't familiar with these sorts of things don't understand
Yeah,
that concept. So the break is literally meant so that the gas is not all just coming out of the end of the barrel, but it's actually being dispersed by
correct.
the device that's on the end, right?
Yes,
The
and think
muzzle
of it
device.
like a brake for a car. This is a brake for your muzzle of the gun. So it's to purely to reduce recoil.
Okay.
Now the term compensator and muzzle brake uh, can have a blurry area because some brakes have vertical porting to keep the muzzle down and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
Our objective was total control
Right.
while also not having debilitating concussion.
Right.
And
So
so kind of, yeah.
And kind of on that point, again, just as so people understand, the brake what that has like side porting where the gases come out the side, it's effective in keeping the gun much more level.
Mhm.
It's incredibly loud.
Yes.
So like if you go to a gun range and things like that, you will get a lot of reaction from the people around you, like how loud this firearm is,
Oh, yes.
and it's shocking, like the amount of concussion that is released from that, right?
Absolutely.
So and a lot of just kind of go back to what you're saying. The design is not only to like reduce like kind of the muzzle rise, but to kind of also help flatten that out too, so it's not disturbing everybody around you or like being so concussive that people can handle it.
Absolutely. And the ports on traditional muzzle brakes behave like speakers. So
Right.
that's where the blast wave actually comes back at you versus going substantially just straight forward.
Hmm.
To go out to the sides, it's still swiveled closer back at you. So you're
Hmm.
going to feel increased concussion. It's not that more concussion is created, but theoretically, not that I would recommend anyone do that for obvious safety reasons. If you were standing, breaking that 180 degrees, standing downrange from the muzzle, please
Uh,
never do this. Obviously, the concussion is going to be thrown forward, and you'd be in
hmm.
that bad space.
Hmm.
Versus for some, so the worst muzzle brakes, not to say that they're not effective from a physics standpoint,
Hmm.
the most concussive muzzle brakes will have slats that actually angle back towards you, not up to the
Right.
side, but angled back towards you.
Right.
And like, man, you can pretty much light a cigar with some of those. Like those bend. Now they are impressive with their level of force in terms of reduction of counter recoil force.
Hmm.
So they are effective in that way, but you pay for it in that symptom of
Right.
just that back blast that you feel in your chest.
Right.
Yeah.
I've actually done like training classes where everybody shows up and they have their own rifle, and I had one that had a pretty substantial muzzle brake on it, and it was literally disturbing the other people,
Yeah.
like because it was such a shock they weren't used to that, that it was like it was throwing off their shots and things like that. So obviously that isn't the intention that you're trying to go for, assuming that this is a rifle that you ever had to actually take into a battle scenario, whatever that might be, Red Dawn, whatever,
Yeah.
that isn't the goal, and you certainly don't want that amount of concussion to throwing off people that are potentially your allies, you know, let alone what it's doing to you, if you're not prepared for those sorts of things, so
Absolutely.
just throwing that out
No, absolutely. And we have law enforcement actually using the brake, which is a
there.
good testament to, I'm not saying the product is perfect.
Hmm.
It's definitely been, paving its own way as far as like it's its own thing.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm actually waiting on permission for several departments saying, yes, we can list you as those that use it because we're getting more and more law enforcement interest, which is great.
Right.
So that was our first product. But to kind of wrap up that topic of what we were trying to do with the design of it, it wasn't to be, if we boil everything down into recoil reduction percentage,
Hmm.
it wasn't to be the very top dog, in terms of absolute very highest percentage you can, because in
Hmm.
order to do that, you have to create that sort of concussion that comes pretty much back at you and people really close by you, um, anywhere near you as a shooter.
Right.
And so that becomes pretty combat incompatible pretty quickly to the point where any training class is like, I don't want to be next to that guy,
Right.
and we've all felt that sort of
Hmm.
concussion and it's nasty, especially when every now and again you'll have somebody who doesn't understand that the shorter the barrel, the more bark you have. And then we put a brake on top of that. So you'll have people with like, 10.5-inch barrels running aggressive brakes. And I'm like,
Right.
what are you doing? And
Yeah.
they just genuinely don't know.
Hmm.
They didn't anticipate. They just thought it was an AR, so it's just a short barrel. I'm like,
Right.
you'll try that in one outing and realize that this is a lot more, especially indoors. It's amplified,
Hmm.
but we need it to be something that I didn't like this idea that it could only be used for competition,
Hmm.
only be used as a range toy, only for this, only for that. Um, I mean, I'd say the one criticism I'll give it is, yeah, it was never designed to be something that a suppressor slips over as a QD mount,
Hmm.
but it was made to be on its own, objectively, something for like a patrol carbine,
Right.
where you could use it in a gunfight and it doesn't have debilitating concussion. At the same time, yes, it's substantial in terms of recoil reduction,
Hmm.
but the big payoff was the combination of there's no muzzle rise
Hmm.
and the concussion isn't debilitating. So therefore, your rapid target acquisition is the payoff.
Right. And so I guess using law enforcement is a way of thinking of these things because if they're actually using these on a regular basis, like within their own units and that the sort of thing, you don't want the person that's your fellow officer or your other people that are in the unit be completely thrown off by what you're doing
For sure.
to the point where they're no longer effective. So um along with that idea, how much like signature reduction is there in the adapter or the muzzle devices?
So that's a really good question because it really depends on barrel length and ammunition.
Hmm.
And I've even had a review, not to take a swipe on it, whatsoever, but I had somebody say it was really flashy. Well, I'll say this is versus just a bare muzzle, no device on it, just a
Hmm.
straight tube. That's going to be as flashy as it gets.
Hmm.
And what happens is essentially you end up with the bullet, flies by and then kind of unseals that system of all this burnt and unburned, gas, powder, etc., in the column that is cylinder that is the barrel. When it finally uncorks and that bullet goes flying for an for a barrel with no muzzle device on it, you end up with like a toroid shape, which in layman's terms is kind of like it goes from a stream of gases to immediately slows down to like a ball.
Hmm.
So almost in some sense like a mushroom cloud almost. It goes from like a
Right.
straight column of gases to it balls up real fast and it's spinning and it's basically it gets to a certain air fuel oxygen mixture and it flashes. That's where you get a big muzzle flash.
Right.
Shorter the barrel, the more of that there is. Because as you go from like a 20-inch barrel down to a 10.5, for example, the shorter you cut that barrel off, the pressure dissipates as the barrel as the projectile goes down the barrel.
Right.
So really short barrels, that sort of uncorking um, dynamic of say you have theoretically, 7.5-inch barrel.
Hmm.
Well, at that point in a barrel, 7.5 inches in, there's so much pressure
Hmm.
that doesn't kind of peter out, so to speak, that at 20 inches will be night and day. So not to nerd out completely on this, but basically,
Right.
um, the shorter the barrel, um, the more fireworks and display, so to speak.
Right.
Versus if you have something like a 16 to 20-inch barrel, it's much more tame.
Hmm.
Now, all that to say for signature reduction, um, any break is going to have reduced signature versus just called a naked muzzle.
Hmm.
If you have nothing on it or a thread protector or there's no muzzle device, just a naked muzzle,
Hmm.
any break is going to have signature reduction from there.
Hmm.
And this isn't a flash hider, so that works by breaking up that plume, that toroid shape, and because it breaks it up, it doesn't get that fuel oxygen mixture to have that big flash.
Hmm.
So the flash is much more muted, which is how flash hiders work.
Right.
But for the Nero 556, the slats, they do assist with concussion being thrown a little bit diagonally forward.
Hmm.
But as far as signature reduction for flash specifically, we tell law enforcement, for example, use duty issue ammo. And the reason I say that is so if it's a 16-inch barrel,
Hmm.
15.5, 16 inches, whatever, you're not doing something super short, which is what we don't. You can obviously run break on a 10.5, but it's just not comfortable. It's just not what I would put on
Right.
it personally.
Yeah.
Not that you couldn't, but say it's on a 16-inch barrel,
Hmm.
um, you can get a break, whether it's ours or somebody else's,
Hmm.
to flash almost not at all by just good ammo. Why? Because the powder composition in duty issue ammo, the nice
Hmm.
stuff, that flash retardant in the powder formula is much more meticulous and deliberately chosen for things like low flash than your gut bucket, cheap as they come, 5.56, 55 grain training ammo.
Right.
And to the point where we actually tell departments like, yeah, absolutely put it through its evaluations. Here's the recommended barrel length.
Hmm.
Because every now and again you'll have somebody put it on a really short one and just not think about that, and we try to give them some guidance. But we'll say I know duty issues, no joke as far as cost wise, but at least run one magazine through that because that's going to be indicative of if you're in a firefight, that's what you have with you. So of course
Mhm,
do that, but also you'll see that the flash is night and day.
mhm.
So if you use like certain ammo has almost no flash retardant, and it's completely obvious.
Right.
Even if it's a bright day out.
Yeah.
Other ammo is like, and I even have a video on my phone. I recently did this night vision event where right before we, put on, NVGs, and even afterwards, I'm like, let's, shoot the Nero and take a video,
Mhm,
and you could see it in utter darkness,
mhm.
and there was a bit of a spark at the end.
Okay.
You use the right ammo, it goes away.
Mhm.
And I think most people don't know that. They'll use, 5.56 is 5.56. And I'm like, no, there's a whole world
Right.
of, if you're using some, you know, uh, nice, obviously not, inexpensive
Mhm.
hollow points, et cetera, that are made for, patrol carbines or Hornady tap or something.
Right.
That's not the same powder as whatever you got on, Lucky Gunner or whatever. But you bought the cheap as you could.
Right.
Uh, for someone who does this, it's important to know that like absolutely you can dial that flash up or down to nothing.
Mhm,
So I'm trying to choose my words specifically because uh, so legally,
mhm.
Nero 5.56 can be sold in all 50 states because
Right.
it's a muzzle device.
Mhm.
Sorry, it is a muzzle device. It's a muzzle brake, not a flash hider. So
Right.
it was not engineered to be a flash hider,
Mhm.
but for shooters out there, if you want to
Right.
reduce that flash, choose better ammo and it goes away.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess part of the reason I think of that or I bring that up is because I've heard stories. Uh, I believe his name is Kevin Owen, who was former Special Forces military, told
Mhm.
the story about how he had opened fire on insurgents, and because he didn't have a great muzzle device on the rifle, that gave away his position when he started firing, right?
Yeah.
And effectively, they just opened fire on his position, right? And luckily, he was able to survive that and get away.
Yep.
But that isn't always the case, right? And again, we aren't all law enforcement and military, but if we're ever found in a position where we're trying to actually deal with whatever scenario that calls for us to actually use those sorts of things, we want to have the most effective tools possible,
Yeah.
right? And signature reduction is a part of that. And so when I think of suppressors, I think of those in the same manner that they're there to suppress the sound,
Mhm.
but even beyond that, they're there to suppress the flash signature,
Yeah.
right? And so anything that helps with that is a great benefit,
Yeah.
right?
So to answer the question directly, because I don't want suddenly, people in California not to be able to buy it or
Right.
because the thing is they, for whatever reason, what do most uppers come with? A bird cage.
Right.
But some of these blue states, they don't want to let you even have a bird cage because, oh, it's a flash hider, but you can have a break. So I will say legally, this is a break.
Right.
But you can have the flash very low to negligible on these, which is,
Right.
with intent of, yeah,
Hmm.
if you have a really flashy muzzle device, it's not going to be, you
Hmm.
know, um, combat compatible whatsoever.
Right.
So, with that in mind, we just kind of give the little asterisk of don't use, absolutely cheap as they come, gut bucket ammo. And
Right.
even then, like we had it out, we were, I think in Marana, this is dead of night,
Hmm.
and we saw some sparks out the end.
Hmm.
And this is like absolutely you have to have like your PVS 14s on to actually see anything.
Right.
So that's really cool. But and I'm just taking a picture of not just not through the night vision, but just the naked signature of no nods on or anything. What does it look like with that
Right.
flash? And it was quite low.
Hmm.
So absolutely, it's super important
Hmm.
because at the end of the day, heard some sobering statistic about, especially I think in the Second World War, about lifespan and engagement with as a machine gunner because there's so much attention called to you.
Right.
So absolutely, it's like saying, "Here I am, look at me," and it's the last thing you want, of
Right.
course.
And again, this goes back to like law enforcement, that
Yep.
sort of thing. If they're actually in a situation where they're dealing with either one or multiple people that are firing back at them, the idea is not to just announce, "Hey, I'm right here. Come please shoot at me."
Yep.
That isn't what they're going for, right? And obviously, again, not all of us are in law enforcement or military, but that doesn't change the idea that we want tools that are the most effective for whatever scenario we find ourselves in,
Right.
right? So kind of along with that, you have not only the muzzle devices themselves, but you have other things. So could you get into some of those, like where
Absolutely.
those things fit in?
Uh, we've got a whole line of bulk carrier groups. We're coming out with another one here soon. Probably our most well known is our titanium bulk carrier group. So the
Hmm.
carrier itself is grade 5 titanium, and it's got a good DLC coating. Um, it's not skeletonized, but it's crazy lightweight.
Hmm.
But it's got the M16 mil spec geometry, so uh, it's incredibly reliable, even being a low mass BCG.
Hmm.
We've made the Michigan's OCKS screws standard on all of our BCGs, just because anytime we see something that
Right.
hands down it's a better component.
Hmm.
We're actually big on evolving our products over time, so we make all sorts of, even if we don't make a press release about it,
Hmm.
we like to incorporate, a better design and evolve things.
Right.
So we've got, a high polish nickel boron. Not to say that's, innovative by itself, but it's just well executed, I would say.
Hmm.
But from there, we've got FDE DLC, and soon we're going to be coming out with a polished DLC, which is like a black mirror. And
Okay.
so it's just super low maintenance,
Right.
crazy slippery to the touch, but just well executed and ready to run hard. But beyond the BCG world of things, we've got two things. One thing's really exciting on the horizon, and I almost hesitate talking about it just because we've actually stopped posting videos on it because we get a lot of hate when I can't say here's where you go buy it and here's how it works.
Right.
So we actually came up with a way to actually um, record through, say, an aim point or an EOTech
Hmm.
and aim and film at the same time. So you have that kind of Call of Duty perspective.
Gotcha.
And those videos have just like taken over Instagram when we posted them.
Hmm.
But if there's not something can do about it, the amount of frustration people get over like, why
Right.
won't you tell me how it works and why can't I have one? So we've made tremendous progress. I mean, I was even working on it up until about 3 hours ago in SolidWorks and just in dialing things in. We're making
Right.
tremendous progress. So that's going to be this year is my hope to release that. That's going to be really exciting because whether it's a training aid or just making awesome content, it's been kind of that impossible perspective.
Right.
Uh, let's see what else. We got three different flavors for the brakes. Obviously, the 556 is the first one we started with, and that was actually just as I was learning all things 3D modeling, um, hypersonic fluid dynamics, just all the things that came into it. I just had that momentum of, I just want to do this.
Hmm.
And so we started with it just because it was just, the, it built that momentum for me.
Hmm.
But since then, we've released a 9 millimeter model for PCCs and subguns, and then the Nero 762, which is for 308. It does the same thing on 308. So, say on an AR-10, as fast as you can pull the trigger, it just stays level
Right.
and keeps that concussion moderate. And let's see, the other thing we do, I don't know if it's try not to just run into that one time. And
Right.
but we actually make these. These are the Nile silicon carbide M-Lok rail covers, and this has
Okay.
been pretty popular with Lily especially. But wow, so that's actually it's got a recessed region in the middle. That's actually that grid is inlaid by hand. So we take high temp epoxy and then put silicon carbide granules on top of it. And it has this just stupid grippy texture,
Right.
but it's recessed enough where if you look at the very top
Hmm.
of the panel, that way it doesn't snag on plate carriers, things like that. And
Right.
you actually have to engage it with your hands. It's just not going to grab and rip at everything because the texture is super aggressive. And then on the back, just one of my personal gripes is with rail covers before I design my own was to put a redundant install system in.
Hmm.
So once it's in, it's not coming off. Heat, rub it up against a barrier or whatever, and it's coming out when you say it comes out, not,
Right.
by accident. So
Exactly.
um, the M-Lok furniture has been our latest product, and now we do those in FDE as well.
That's really impressive. I mean, just the amount of, obviously I can't demonstrate just through the camera, but the sheer amount of like texture and what would you call that? the grip, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know what else to call that. Like, is pretty extensive. I mean, this is like once you're holding on to this, it is not going to slide.
No.
Even if your hands were wet, lubricated, whatever, you're still going to have a fair amount of purchase on that.
Oh yeah.
You
No, and it's all about that in that balance too of it's not just caked on top, so you actually have to do it deliberately.
know?
And on that level, it's it's not a pet peeve or a gripe or anything, but obviously it gets immediately compared to grip tape because that's what it kind of feels like.
Right.
But that's the most aggressive silicon carbide we could find. Um, basically compared to grip tape. Now, this is very similar to when you have a competition Glock frame where you go to a gunsmith and they take your frame and they coat it with epoxy and they put silicon carbide on top of it.
Hmm.
Unless you're running, mag after mag after mag of, on a G18 full auto and getting
Right.
that frame really hot. Well, the thing is that when you put this on AR-15 and you put a bunch of them all the way around
Hmm.
your M-Lok handguard, uh, we've gotten barrels up to like, you know, 750 degrees, for example, Fahrenheit. And heat is no joke in this area. You're right by a gas block. You got a barrel, you got a gas tube,
Right.
and it's a whole different animal. And so you take something like grip tape, it does not like that heat. Or
Got to break down.
it does. I mean, it's adhesive. It's just, it's tape essentially.
Hmm.
And not just tape, but the epoxy we use, for example,
Hmm.
is like you're not going to melt that off.
Right.
It's not because, yeah, most people aren't going to go crazy with their guns and get it to that, but someone will. I will. Uh,
Right.
and so we have to engineer it with that extreme use in mind. Like I
Yeah.
said, I don't like this planned obsolescence of like, oh, well, you mag dumped too much, so you wore
Right.
out your grip panels. That's insane.
Yeah.
I pretty much want you to like you had to have messed up your barrel or something by the time you have to replace those. Like I
Right.
wanted to make it with that level of like you had to have taken your upper into some extreme situation
Right.
before you have to worry about
Uh-huh.
anything. And by then, any other panel would be in dire circumstances. So
Right.
these were made with specifically with where they're going to be on say your upper.
Hmm.
What could happen?
Hmm.
What is some Yahoo going to do out in the desert somewhere? It's going to end up on AR15.com or something. Like
Right.
you have to engineer for that extreme, like what if? And we
Right.
did. And so versus just like that, yes, it just has silicon carbide on it. We tried to make it so that it's pretty much about as bomb proof as it can get.
Right.
So,
Yeah, because I mean, there definitely are people who are going to try to stress test these things. There are people that just for the sheer fun of it
oh,
decide that
they will.
I'm going to mag dump multiples of thousands of rounds through an AR
Yep,
to see where the failure points are, things like that. And that shouldn't be the thing that fails, you know.
absolutely. And I will say firsthand, and when we were doing heat tests, and we did a lot of them, various epoxies, everything. But of course, I put it on an M-Lok handguard on an AK because it
Mhm.
touches the barrel in multiple points, and there's not much of an air gap between the handguard and the barrel. And we had a bunch of 30 and 40 round magazines, probably about 14 consecutive ones, and I would just go mag after mag after mag, and eventually, like, you use a thermal cam and a laser thermometer, like how hot is each thing?
Right.
And of course, okay, successful test, and of course, I'm wearing Nomex gloves. The Nomex only comes to here, and I got burned here. Turns out guns get
Right.
really hot.
Right.
Um, but you have to put it through its paces
Yeah.
firsthand because you have to know what to expect. You don't want to put it out there and hope uh, like nobody
Yeah.
does what you don't think they'll do. Like they'll do it.
Right.
They'll do it and like halfway pound themselves too.
Mhm.
So it's you got to anticipate.
So
People are crazy.
I view these things in probably a different light than a lot of people, in the sense that I believe that these things are tools, right?
Yep.
And just because it doesn't have to be capable of doing what it does, doesn't mean that it shouldn't be capable of what it does, right? So, in a completely different context, like somebody who drives, a 3500 Super Duty Max truck, right? Right? It's designed to haul a certain poundage of load, whatever. It's designed to do a job. Whether or not you need that truck or not, that's a whole other conversation, right? But if you buy it for a specific purpose and you do need it to do that, you expect it to work when you need it to, right? You don't expect it to like to almost work or fail at the worst possible time, right? People that are serious about their firearms, especially if they are in law enforcement, if they're in military, if they do competition shooting, or again, in the worst case scenario, shit happens,
Yeah,
you know, they need it to work and they need to know that they can depend on it, that it isn't going to fail them,
absolutely.
right? And the idea behind designing something that is going to work what it needs to, that's the whole point. This goes way back to the earliest part of our conversation. You don't cut corners. You don't design something that has a failure point that you expect purely because you want somebody to buy another thing. You design the thing from the best foundation possible and expect that it's going to work when they need it to.
It's actually one of the things that I'm really glad that I've got the relationship in my company of I not only design everything,
Hmm.
but I own it too. So I'm not doing anything from I don't really care what the Excel spreadsheet says.
Right.
I care that I really like this. I'm going to put my name on it, and I'm proud of it, and I've done it to the best of my ability. And it's going to be oftentimes the symptom of that is it's probably certain people out.
Hmm.
Our brakes are not inexpensive. At the same time, for what
Right.
they are, they're not, you know, crazy over the top, but we didn't cut corners and I'm confident with what I put out there.
Right.
So at the end of the day, um, and I would say this for anyone who's just getting into shooting as well. There's this big temptation of, well, this is how much this was online. It was a special deal. And I would caution anyone to say, step back. And as someone who shot out their first barrel, uh, that was surprising. When you go
Right.
down range and see little boat-shaped holes as opposed to holes that
Right.
should be round. Um, and as a gear designer, I will say the most underrated thing is training.
Hmm.
And when you take a good training course, what happens is gear that you shouldn't have ends up it comes out of the woodwork, something fails.
Right.
And that's good.
Hmm.
And most people, some people get embarrassed about it, but and I'm surrounded myself with good people who train regularly, and I wish I did more of it personally.
Hmm.
But what I always come away with it is a shift in mindset. But what's always from the get-go been present is don't buy the cheaper thing.
Right.
It's so tempting because when you first get into shooting, everything's expensive.
Right.
Why can't I just get that? What's wrong with that one? Or
Hmm.
that one's on sale. And it's the difference between just some nitrided barrel versus a chrome line cold hammer forge.
Hmm.
You might get, say, 9,000 rounds out of a nitrided barrel, and you
Right.
get 20,000 out of that cold hammer forge,
Hmm.
Geisley, chrome lined, good to go. You buy once, cry once.
Right.
And the more I've done this, the more I've like, no, pay the extra money, get the quality,
Hmm.
and it always pays you back. It's never
Right.
not. It's never been something like, oh man, I spent too much money on that thing that's given me no trouble.
Right. Yeah, I have to admit that I've always sort of approached it from that perspective of like if you're going to be investing into something, buy what you're capable of buying and buy something that's good
It's an
rather than
investment.
just like the cheapest thing possible and trying to work up from there. So like the very first AR that I bought was a Patriot Ordnance Factory, which was a or $1,800 rifle at the time, you know, but it's an excellent rifle.
Yeah.
And I know that it will work no matter what under any conditions, and it's designed to be a good rifle, right? It isn't like, and not to disparage any of the other companies that are
Sure.
out there, you can easily go buy a $500 or $600 AR. It will work, it functions, right? But it's not going to work for as well or as long as something that's designed from the get-go to be better.
Oh, I hear you. And I know that some people out there, that's all they can afford, and that's one
Yeah,
thing. But I would say a recommendation for anyone getting into it
right.
is it's an investment for sure.
Yeah.
And on that note, one thing that I think is really tempting, especially like right now, where there's a lot of people griping about ammo prices, they're going back up,
Hmm.
unfortunately. Is there's that temptation to buy whatever's cheapest for 5.56.
Right.
What's the cheapest case of 1,000 I can get? Um, when you've been in this industry and been around things enough,
Hmm.
when you see catastrophic failures, when you see case ruptures, when you see squib loads, when you see just what happens when you don't go with quality, don't cut the corner.
Right.
Not only can it be dangerous, but it's also like, why? How much did you really save?
Mhm.
And I can't emphasize that enough. I mean, do people need a not knocking them whatsoever? Do they need a Knight's Armament, AR-15?
Mhm.
Probably not for their first one. Is there
Probably not.
anything wrong with it if you have one? No. At the
Yeah.
same time, get something of good, decent quality
Mhm.
that you can hang your hat on because
Right.
when you see something that's just an absolute Chinesium piece of crap, like
Right.
I've been to courses where it's like one guy shows up with an airsoft holster, and you're just like,
Right.
what was funny about the story
Mhm.
is that they had an HK Mark 23 in there, and I'm like, you spent how much on the handgun
Right.
itself, and then you chinsed out on the holster? I'm like, I bet you're running tool ammo,
Right.
like
Right.
for the 45 ACP. But people
Right.
have that mentality
Mhm.
of they want to flex on, look at the gun I just picked up,
Mhm.
but they don't want to spend $1,000 on a training course and that 500 rounds of
Right.
ammunition that goes with it and work on themselves.
Mhm.
And in so doing, they'll put their gear through those paces
Right.
and you'll actually come away with, in the course of that, the people who kind of chinsed out on whatever was a good deal
Right.
or like, oh, whatever, it's not really made for guns, for airsoft.
Yeah.
Like that stuff's going to fall apart. And sometimes it's the best thing that can happen for some of those people because they
Right.
realize like that's not up to snuff.
Mhm.
And were this something that your life depends on, like you don't want to be anywhere near that.
Right.
And so your mindset, again, as a gear designer, I'm not trying to, plug gear so much as good gear is the result of if you've trained enough,
Yeah.
you'll say, I want nothing but stuff that I can actually rely on. And there's such a
Right.
value to that. So,
Right.
I've seen red dots go down. Like how much were they? $150.
Mhm.
But then after that training course, they go out there and buy that aim point
Mhm.
and they're super happy with it. Yeah, they're no joke.
Right.
They're not cheap, but you're again confident.
Right.
And I think sometimes it takes stepping on that rake for them to realize like, yeah, I shouldn't have done that.
Right.
So I can't emphasize enough, like go get training. It's an investment in yourself, not so much just your gear,
Right.
but it sharpens you. It changes your mindset. It changes how you think about things.
Yeah.
And, to your point earlier, yeah, there's a lot of, training companies and trainers out there that's like their way is the only way. You're going to run into that.
Mhm.
But hands down, if you can, like make that investment. And it's a tough
Right.
thing to do because the Instagram culture out there, it's not sexy. It's not, hey, look what I just picked up. It's a Desert Eagle with gold tiger striping and 50 AE. Like, no, you
Right.
went in and you got there at, 7 in the morning and sweated your ass off and you put into work
Mhm.
and your thumbs are just sore from loading mags and stuff.
Right.
But you came away a much better shooter.
Mhm.
And yeah, that doesn't sound sexy. Well, what are you going to post on that?
Right.
But that's what most people need to do a lot more of,
Yeah.
myself included. Like I wish I got out there. It's hard to say because Arizona and it's April. Like soon it's going to be 100 and God knows
Yeah.
what. So it's
Right.
like got to get out there while you can,
Yeah.
and then fire restrictions. So it is what
Mhm.
it is. But
So I always kind of equate things to cars because it's a little easier for people to understand.
yeah,
It's like nobody is going to buy a Chevy Cruze and expect it to run and function like a Camaro.
yeah,
Those are completely different things,
yep,
right? And if you're going into it with that mentality, you're going to be disappointed on a monumental level,
oh yeah,
right? One is capable of getting you from A to B, and the other is capable for really high performance. They're designed to do two completely different things, right? If you can afford a Camaro rather, buy the Camaro.
yeah,
That if that's what you want and you understand it and whatever, that's what you should get. If all that you can afford is a Chevy Cruze, don't be discouraged by that. Just understand that it isn't where you're going eventually, you know?
for sure.
Um, and the other thing is that like don't ever it's absolutely ridiculous for somebody to buy a Camaro who's never driven a car, doesn't know anything about them, and can't afford to put the fuel in it. It's like,
Yeah,
well, then why have it? Just to say that you do, that doesn't make any sense. So kind of also keep that in mind when you're looking at these sort of things. You know, buy things that are reasonable for you to afford, but understand that if you're looking for absolute performance, that's going to be in its other category, and understand what you're getting into when you get into that.
oh yeah. I'd say in the world of shooting, there are infinite ways of spending money,
Yeah.
and I think I hear all the time, like, which one of my friends just got a staccato? It's like the sound bite right now. And
Right.
most of them have one, but me. I just haven't pulled the trigger on one, pun intended.
Right.
Uh, but it's one of those things that from the onset, a lot of people getting into things go right for, well, what's the best?
Right.
And it's not about well, it's about what's good enough quality to start,
Hmm.
to your point, but also, um, how do we learn? How do we take that first step and kind of mold ourselves?
Right.
Because without that skill, like you can put a staccato in a lot of people's hands and they can't hit the broadside of the barn.
Hmm.
So is that is like the engineering and the fitting and everything wasted on them? Absolutely. So
Right.
um, one thing I love about shooting is that and it's just like with weightlifting or anything else, you got to put the time in.
Hmm.
If you kind of garner that discipline up and you work on yourself, the results speak for themselves.
Yeah.
There's not somebody who's going to cheat the system and suddenly being an expert marksman the next day.
Right.
It does take the work, the repetition, the muscle memory, the learning. And I'm happy to say also one of the best things about it, it's very sobering and very um, humbling, I think is probably the better word, is you have to work on yourself and undo certain habits and be aware that you have them if you're going to get to where you need to be,
Hmm.
shooting wise.
Right.
Combining that accuracy and speed, whether it's, competition or for training. One thing I love about going to a training course is you come away, if you do it right, with a mindset shift,
Hmm.
and there's something new, mentally kind of brewing.
Right.
Like you obviously came away with new material, which you should. There's always that portion of a course where somebody, gets there, they unload their rifle and everything, and they're doing the dick measuring competition and what they got versus everyone else, and they're
Right.
showing their gear off, and they have a cry on, etc. But they're also not very keen on getting feedback from the instructor who's telling you you're doing something wrong.
Right.
And here's what you need to do, and here's why. And I've heard it before, like, well, my department tells me to do it this way.
Hmm.
Or no, no, I'm not doing that. The worst is now there's being coachable. And then there's just my biggest pet peeve of if someone corrects you on safety,
Hmm.
just take it, do better,
Right.
stay safe, stay sharp. Don't, turn it into an ego thing of, no, I wasn't flagging anyone. Um,
Right.
like no one's saying that for fun.
Right.
And, with training courses, there's the people who want to go there humbly as a student, and you're going to get remolded and reshaped and going to learn something new, hopefully. Otherwise,
Hmm.
what's the point of the course? And then there's those people who want to be, kind of given a pat on the head and be told how tactical they are. You could probably come up and teach this too. Why don't you come up, get away from the students and the riffraff, come up here
Yeah.
with us.
Yeah.
And they're not there to learn,
Hmm.
which blows my mind because it is an investment to go to a lot of these courses.
Right.
But at the same time, you know, that same person is focused on the gear first and not sharpening themselves.
Right. Yeah. There's a whole mentality that kind of goes with that. Like you said, kind of the day measuring where,
Yeah,
you've got like just this really awesome firearm rifle, and it's super expensive. It's got all the thermals, like high end,
totally.
everything on it. It's like, and yet you couldn't shoot, like you said, the broadside of a barn. It's like you're not John Wick because you have an expensive rifle. Those two things are not the same,
Yeah.
you know. If you're not going to take the time and actually learn how to use the equipment that you've got, it doesn't do you any good to have it.
And I've got some friends just being a part of this industry that one thing I love about them most is that I can be wrong in front of them
Hmm.
and they'll teach me something about whether it's an optic or whatever else. We all have our
Right.
obscure knowledge areas about like you're the expert in this, but it's like school me because I walk away with so much more. And how else are you going to learn this stuff?
Hmm.
But you build each other up.
Hmm.
There's not this whole look at me, I'm the expert at all things guns. There's always somebody who wants to be that guy
Right.
of, I know all the things.
Hmm.
I'm like, oh, those people are no fun to be around.
Right.
Um, and I'm always still learning too. Like there's a lot that, well, I'm always open to new knowledge when it comes to um, this discipline in all aspects. So it's fun being a sponge too, because that's how you get introduced to other people.
Hmm.
You get new product ideas as a result, and it's a lot of it's just good conversation, getting to know people before you know it, they lay an idea on you, and it gets your mind turning,
Mhm.
and out comes a new product.
Right.
But it's an evolution. It's
Mhm.
just this nonstop thing.
And to kind of build on that, there's like humility is its own reward in a
Yeah,
sense that, you know, if you're humble enough to accept training and teaching from other people, right? Because you don't know everything.
for
None of
sure.
us does. Okay. And if you're willing to accept that and say that somebody else does have something that they can contribute to your training and to your education, right? And you roll with that, that makes you a much easier person to get along with. And then they're much more likely to say, hey, by the way, this is somebody else I know. You can probably learn from them too, you know, or versus being the sort of person that's like, well, I know everything and you can't tell me shit, and just completely disregard everything they say. They're not going to want anything to do with you. They're not going to be, if you know everything, then obviously you don't need them. So why would they bother helping you? You know?
Absolutely. No,
So
it's absolutely the case. And I have to say, on that note, when it comes to that humility, it's probably one of the things that product development taught me the most
mm-hmm,
is how many times you're going to fail before you get to something that's actually worth putting out there.
mm-hmm,
And so many people want to cut that corner and just say, "Oh, it's good enough, put it out there. If there's a problem, we'll hear about it." And like that's the problem. You will hear about it.
right.
And there's a lot of pressure from like whether it's wholesalers or somebody who knows something's coming out of just like, when's that happening? When's that happening? And the our POV system is a good example of like we're working on it pretty aggressively, but when it's ready, it'll be ready, and
Mm-hmm,
I'll stand behind it, and it'll be awesome. And we're not just going to rush it out there to make somebody appeased, but you'd be surprised of how many times like, oh, this should be fine. This is our last prototype. Promise, last prototype. 6 prototypes later, you're just
right.
dialing stuff in plus or minus a millimeter.
Mm-hmm,
But it's humbling because you realize like, how could I not have seen this? How could I not have known this would happening? This would be happening, but it puts you in your place.
right.
And in the process of discovery, it sometimes makes you less sure-footed than I wish I was because you sometimes you're like, nope, I'm gonna make that change in SolidWorks. We're just gonna go with it. Like, no, we're not. We're gonna make a whole nother version. We're gonna try it out,
Right.
live ammo, the whole shebang,
Mm-hmm,
and make sure we're good to go. Like,
yeah.
why not? Take the extra step.
Mm-hmm.
It's gonna delay us 8 weeks. Cool.
Yep. It'll be worth it at the
It'll
end.
be worth it
Right.
because like this is exactly where it needs to be.
Mm-hmm,
But there's so many unanticipated moments where it humanizes it. It makes it seem like, you know, um, you could be a quote unquote expert as a designer or subject matter expert in fluid flow or materials engineering or what have you.
mm-hmm,
Uh, but until you actually put it to the test, you'd be surprised how many things are like, wow, did not see that coming.
right.
And until you do it,
Mm-hmm,
um, that's the real test. So the trial and error part, can really put you behind. Where one thing I'm really happy about with my company is that I don't really care if it takes us longer to develop something.
mm-hmm,
We're never just going to, meet a quota by this quarter, have it out. I'm not going to promise that.
right.
If you can do it right, it's it'll never be, well, how's best to put it? It's right along the lines of buy once, cry once.
Right.
You'll never have to kind of revisit the topic. You'll never have to put a 2.0 out there.
Right.
It'll just be, essentially, we got it right the first time. It took a little longer,
Mm-hmm,
but I kind of like that part of the process, whether that or training where you come away with, didn't see that coming.
mm-hmm,
Better for it now,
right.
but there's no other way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And you never understand your failure points until you put it to an actual test,
for sure.
so you've got to have that as part of the process to understand like where you eventually want to end up.
And you have to get out of your echo chamber. I've
Yeah.
got close friends that have told me like, and we've changed things about, for example, these rail covers,
Yeah.
dimensionally since we started, and it came from a very good place of, hey, this is what I ran into, and the choice was either to be defensive and say, no, 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 it's fine, and for most applications, it's good to go, or hey, get your caliper out, tell me, you know, what do I got to do? What have you run into?
Right.
Because I would have never run into it on my own. And it was obviously not coming from a place of like, hey, your thing sucks. It doesn't fit right there. And here's what, but
Right.
uh, they reached out, they let me know.
Hmm.
Um, but it's humbling. You know, you take the feedback, you make it better.
Right.
Um, if it was perfect, you would never need to evolve it, and we're big on evolving.
Right.
So, you know, it's just one of those things where you keep good friends, you keep your ear to the ground. But you know, I try to especially make myself not above criticism.
Hmm.
You know, you can't just dismiss it,
Right.
and especially like for example with this, it was coming from a very good place, and if he didn't say it, I would have never have come across this.
Right.
And how many years would go by of just like thinking, oh, this is totally fine,
Hmm.
you know? But one little change, it made a huge difference for
Right.
sure,
Yeah. Which goes back to the sense of humility and understanding that you don't know everything.
for sure.
You have to have feedback from other people and be able to accept that willingly in order to make improvements.
You
So
have to.
that's a wonderful thing. So, kind of like, what's the best way for people to like find you and to find your products and that sort of thing?
So our website is walkerdr.com. So for defense research, so walkerdr.com. And we're on Instagram at Walker Defense and YouTube as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
Which I've started following you there,
thank
and I've
you.
been like watching like some of the short videos and posts that you put out, and it's really interesting stuff. Like I'm
Appreciate that.
really looking forward to actually trying some of the products myself
Yeah.
because they seem really impressive. So
Well, thank you.
let's check that out.
We'll have to get you set up.
But yeah,
Yeah,
I appreciate your time. It was really good to finally meet you.
absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And yeah, hopefully, as kind of like everything develops and you have even more products, things come out in the future, we'll be back on and like talk more about that and kind of go
Absolutely.
from there.
Love to.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
All right then. Bye, everybody. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, you can now support the Non Victim Nation by donating via listener support directly on Spotify. Remember, the story of your life is being written right now, and you are the hero.